The galaxy had grown used to hearing humans talk, and humans were very good at talking, because for 200 years since they first learned to travel between stars, they had filled every communication channel with their voices and their music, and their endless broadcasts about everything from cooking shows to sports games to news reports about nothing important, and the other alien species found it amusing. At first, then annoying. Then finally, they just accepted it as background noise, like the hum of a ship engine that never stops. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant and watched the last evacuation ships jump to faster than light speed and disappear into the darkness of space, and his face showed nothing, even though his heart was pounding because what he was about to do would change everything for every human in the galaxy, and maybe for every alien species too. He looked at Lieutenant Amy Parker, who sat at her console with her hands shaking slightly over the controls, and she looked back at him with wide eyes because she knew what was coming. And she had asked him 3 times if he was really sure about this, and each time he had said yes without hesitation. Jake took a deep breath and spoke the words that had been planned for 3 months in absolute secrecy, by the highest levels of human government and military command, and his voice was calm and steady when he said, "Execute protocol silence." Amy hesitated for just 1 more second, and her finger hovered over the button that would send the signal to every human colony, and every human ship, and every human station across 300 worlds, and 1,000 orbital platforms. And then she pressed it. The silence happened fast, and it happened everywhere at once because humans had spent months preparing for this exact moment, and they had tested it in secret and rehearsed it until every single person knew exactly what to do when the signal came. On Earth, the broadcasting towers that had sent signals into space for centuries went dark, and the orbital relay stations stopped transmitting, and the communication satellites switched to receiving mode only, and across the homeworld, 12 billion people stopped using their personal communicators and their entertainment systems, and anything else that sent a signal beyond the atmosphere. On the colony world of New Portland, the lights in the cities dimmed to minimum power, and the spaceport stopped broadcasting landing instructions, and the orbital defense platforms went into what looked like standby mode, but was actually something much more dangerous. On the mining stations in the asteroid belts and the research facilities orbiting gas giants and the trading posts at the edge of human space, the pattern repeated exactly the same way, because every human had been told this day might come, and when it did, they needed to follow the plan without question. The whole thing took less than 60 seconds from the moment Jake gave the order to the moment the last human signal faded from the galaxy's communication networks, and then there was nothing but silence where humanity used to be. On the planet Vorathis, which served as the homeworld for the Galactic Council, the first person to notice was a diplomat named Gentar, who had been assigned to monitor human affairs for the past 10 years, and he had spent most of that time complaining about how loud humans were and how they never stopped broadcasting, and how their section of the diplomatic quarter was always blazing with lights and sound at all hours. Gentar was working late in his office when he noticed that the usual background noise from the human section had stopped, and at first he thought maybe they were having some kind of technical problem. But when he checked the diplomatic communication channels, there was nothing, and when he tried to call the human ambassador's office, there was no response. And when he sent a priority message through official channels, it bounced back as undeliverable. He stood up from his desk and walked to his window, which overlooked the diplomatic quarter, and he could see the human section clearly, because normally it was lit up like a small sun with their excessive use of lights and display screens. But now, it was completely dark except for a few small emergency lights that barely showed through the windows. Gentar felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was genuine concern. Because in all his years of dealing with humans, they had never been quiet and they had never gone dark, and something about this sudden silence felt wrong in a way he could not explain. He sent an urgent message to the council chairman, and within an hour every major power in the galaxy was trying to contact humanity, and getting nothing back except silence. What the Galactic Council did not know and what Gentar could not have guessed was that 3 months earlier, a human deep space monitoring station on the edge of known space had detected something that made every military analyst on Earth stop breathing for a moment. The monitoring station was called Outpost 7, and it was commanded by Captain Lisa Monroe, who had been running deep space surveillance missions for 8 years and had never seen anything more interesting than the occasional pirate ship or lost cargo hauler. Lisa had been reviewing the daily scanner reports when one of her technicians, a young man named Danny Brooks, called her over to his station with an urgency in his voice that made her move fast. What Danny showed her on his screen was a gravitational distortion pattern that indicated a massive number of ships all in one area, and the computer estimated at least 3,000 vessels based on the size and distribution of the distortions, and that was more ships than any known trading fleet or exploration group would ever have in one place. Lisa ordered a full spectrum analysis and deployed every sensor probe they had, and over the next 6 hours they gathered enough data to make her hands shake when she sent the encrypted report back to Earth Fleet Command. The ships were Krell, and the Krell were not traders or explorers, and they were not friends of humanity or anyone else, because the Krell Empire had built its power by conquering 17 different species over the past 2 centuries, and now they had assembled the largest invasion fleet anyone had ever seen, and it was positioned exactly on the trajectory that would bring them into human space. Earth Fleet Command received Lisa's report, and within 24 hours every military leader and government official who had the security clearance to know about it was in emergency meetings that lasted for days, and the conclusion they reached was simple and terrifying, which was that the Krell were coming to conquer humanity, and the Galactic Council would do nothing to stop them, because the Council never interfered in what they called territorial disputes. That was when someone suggested protocol silence, and at first everyone thought it was crazy, but the more they discussed it, the more sense it made, because the one advantage humanity had was that everyone thought they knew everything about humans, and humans were loud and chaotic and emotional, and they broadcast everything they did to anyone who would listen. The Krell had been listening to human broadcasts for years, and they had studied human culture and human tactics and human military capabilities, or at least what they thought were human military capabilities, because while humans had been broadcasting entertainment and sports and news, they had also been doing something else entirely. Jake Morrison had been part of the planning team that developed Protocol Silence, and he had argued strongly for it, because he understood something that most aliens did not understand about humans, which was that humans had been fighting wars since before they invented writing, and they had developed more ways to kill each other than any other species in the galaxy, and they had learned from every single one of those wars. The plan was simple in concept but incredibly complex in execution, and it required every human to trust that their leaders knew what they were doing, even though those leaders could not explain the plan to most people, because if the Krell suspected anything, the whole thing would fail. Protocol Silence was based on one fundamental principle, which was that if your enemy thinks they know everything about you, then you can use that knowledge against them by becoming something they did not expect. The Krell expected humans to panic when they invaded, and they expected humans to call for help from the Galactic Council, and they expected humans to fight in the same loud, chaotic way they did everything else, and all of those expectations were about to become weapons that humans would use against them. Amy Parker finished entering the final commands and turned to Jake and said, "It is done, sir, and every human facility is now in silent running mode." And Jake nodded and said, "Good, now we wait for them to come, and when they do, they are going to learn something about humanity that we have been hiding behind all that noise." The Valiant and the rest of the Earth Defense Fleet moved into position around Earth's outer orbital zone, and they powered down every system that was not absolutely essential, and they activated stealth mode, which was a technology that humans had developed in secret while everyone thought they were just building entertainment satellites and cargo haulers. Across human space, the pattern repeated, and military forces moved into hiding positions, and civilian populations went into their shelters, and everyone waited in silence for the enemy to arrive. And the galaxy wondered where humanity had gone and why they had stopped talking, and what it meant that the noisiest species in known space had suddenly gone completely quiet. The Krell invasion fleet crossed into human territory on a Tuesday morning Earth time, and Fleet Commander Drask stood on the bridge of his massive flagship and felt confident because his species had conquered 17 worlds using the exact same strategy, and it had never failed. Drask had spent months studying human broadcasts and watching their entertainment programs and analyzing their news reports, and he had concluded that humans were emotional and disorganized, and they relied too much on asking others for help instead of fighting their own battles, and this made them perfect targets for conquest. His fleet consisted of 3,000 warships, and they were arranged in the traditional Krell battle formation, which was a straight-line advance that had broken the defenses of every species they had ever fought, and Drask saw no reason why humans would be any different. The first target was the human colony of New Portland, which had a population of 15 million and substantial orbital defenses, and a strategic location that would serve as the perfect staging ground for the complete conquest of human space. Drask expected to see the orbital defense platforms lighting up his sensors as soon as his fleet appeared, and he expected to hear frantic distress calls on every communication channel, and he expected the humans to either surrender immediately or put up a brief and disorganized resistance before surrendering anyway. What he got instead was silence and empty space where his intelligence reports said there should be defense platforms, and no response to any of his hails, and no ships fleeing in panic, and no signs of military activity at all. He stared at his tactical display and felt something unfamiliar, which was confusion because New Portland was definitely there, and the cities were intact, and power signatures indicated millions of people living in those cities. But nobody was responding, and nobody was transmitting, and the orbital defenses were simply gone. Drask sent forward scout ships to investigate, and he watched their progress on his screens as they approached the planet cautiously, because even the scouts were confused about what they were seeing. On the surface of New Portland, a man named Colonel Greg Hayes watched through reinforced observation ports as the Krell scout ships entered the atmosphere, and he smiled because everything was going exactly according to plan. Greg had been preparing for this moment for 3 months ever since Protocol Silence had been explained to the military commanders, and he had spent that time drilling his forces and the civilian population until everyone knew exactly what to do when the enemy arrived. The civilians were hidden in underground shelters that had been constructed over the past decade under the cover of expanded subway systems and storage facilities, and those shelters were shielded against sensors and scanning technology, and they could support the entire population for months if necessary. The military forces were positioned in concealed bunkers that looked like ordinary buildings from above, and they had strict orders not to fire until Greg gave the signal, and everyone understood that timing was everything. Greg watched as 12 Krell scout ships landed in the central plaza of the capital city, and alien soldiers emerged from those ships expecting to find either resistance or surrender, and finding instead empty streets and silent buildings. The Krell soldiers moved cautiously through the city, and they carried scanning equipment and weapons, and they checked every building methodically looking for the human population that their sensors said should be there, but could not locate. What the Krell did not know was that their sensors were being carefully spoofed by human technology that made the population signatures appear scattered and weak, when in reality 15 million people were sitting quietly in shelters watching video feeds of the aliens walking through their empty streets. Greg waited and watched and counted the minutes because the main Krell fleet was still in orbit, and the orbital platforms that everyone thought were gone were actually hidden behind the moon in full stealth mode, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when Fleet Commander Drask decided that the planet was essentially undefended, and ordered his main fleet to take up positions in orbit and begin the occupation, and that was when Greg spoke one word into his encrypted communicator, which was now. Captain Lisa Monroe commanded the defense platform Nightfall, and she had been waiting behind the moon for 6 hours with her entire crew in absolute silence, and when she received Greg's signal, she smiled and said to her weapons officer, "Light them up." The orbital defense platforms had been modified over the past 3 months, with new stealth technology and upgraded weapon systems and targeting computers that could track and fire on multiple targets simultaneously, and they had been positioned perfectly to catch the Krell fleet in a crossfire. Nightfall and 40 other platforms opened fire at the same time, and the Krell fleet, which was arranged in their traditional straight-line formation, became the easiest targets that Lisa had ever seen in her entire military career. The first salvo destroyed 30 Krell warships before they even understood they were under attack, and the second salvo took out another 20, and by the time the Krell started trying to maneuver and return fire, they had lost over 60 ships and their perfect formation had collapsed into chaos. Drask watched his tactical display fill with red warning lights and casualty reports, and he could not understand what had happened, because there were supposed to be no defenses here, and humans were supposed to be disorganized, and where had all these weapons platforms come from? He ordered his fleet to retreat and regroup, But the human platforms were moving now, and they were faster than Krell ships because they were smaller and more maneuverable, and they pursued the fleeing warships like predators chasing prey. On the surface, Greg gave another signal, and the military forces emerged from their bunkers and surrounded the Krell soldiers who had landed in the city, and those soldiers found themselves facing human weapons and human soldiers who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The Krell ground forces surrendered without firing a shot because they were outnumbered 50-1, and their command ship in orbit had just been destroyed, and they had no idea if reinforcements were coming or if the entire invasion fleet had been wiped out. Greg accepted their surrender and had them secured in detention facilities, and then he opened a communication channel to Earth Fleet Command and reported that New Portland was secure and the enemy had been routed with minimal human casualties. The same pattern repeated across human space because the Krell had divided their fleet to attack multiple colonies simultaneously, and at every location, they found the same thing, which was silence followed by devastating ambushes. At the colony of New Dallas, the Krell found orbital defense platforms hidden in asteroid fields, and at the colony of New Boston, they found minefields that their sensors had not detected, and at the colony of New Chicago, they found human fighters that appeared out of nowhere using stealth technology that should not have existed. Admiral Susan Blake coordinated the entire defense from a hidden command center deep inside an asteroid, and she watched the battle reports coming in from every front, and she felt satisfied because the plan was working even better than they had hoped. Susan had been one of the architects of Protocol Silence, and she had argued that the key to defeating the Krell was to use their own assumptions against them and make them believe that humans were exactly what they appeared to be, which was loud and disorganized and unprepared. The Krell had spent years listening to human broadcasts, and they had concluded that they understood human military doctrine and human tactical thinking and human strategic planning, and all of those conclusions were completely wrong, because humans had been broadcasting one thing while preparing something entirely different. While the galaxy listened to human music and watched human sports and consumed human entertainment, the human military had been studying every war ever fought by every species in the galaxy, and they had been developing weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter the known strategies of potential enemies. The Krell fought in straight lines because their culture valued direct confrontation and honorable combat, and they expected their enemies to fight the same way, and they had never encountered an enemy that refused to follow those rules. Humans had no such cultural restrictions, and they had learned thousands of years ago that the best way to win a war was to fight, in whatever way gave you the advantage, and honor was something you worried about after you had survived. Lisa Monroe pursued the retreating Krell fleet, and her platforms picked off stragglers and disabled command ships and generally made it impossible for the enemy to regroup or mount any kind of organized resistance. She had grown up on Earth reading history books about naval warfare and guerrilla tactics and asymmetric conflicts, and she understood that the key to victory was not matching your enemy's strength for strength, but rather attacking their weaknesses while protecting your own. The Krell fleet that had entered human space with 3,000 warships limped away 6 hours later, with less than 1,200 ships still capable of faster-than-light travel, and they left behind wreckage and prisoners, and the growing realization that they had made a terrible mistake. Drask sat in his command chair and stared at his displays and tried to understand what had gone wrong, and the only conclusion he could reach was that humans were not what they appeared to be, and the broadcasts, and the entertainment and the constant noise had all been a disguise hiding something much more dangerous. He sent a message to the Krell High Command explaining what had happened and recommending that they abort the invasion immediately because humanity was not a species of merchants and entertainers, but rather a species of warriors who had been pretending to be something else. The High Command did not believe his report, and they sent orders to regroup and attack again. And Drask knew that his species was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating an enemy based on appearances. The Galactic Council spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what had happened to humanity and why they had gone silent and whether they were even still alive. And the confusion turned to shock when the first reports started coming in about the Krell invasion and its spectacular failure. Ambassador Claire Foster had been waiting for this moment, and she had spent those 3 weeks in her quarters on Earth, preparing her presentation and rehearsing her words because what she was about to tell the Council would change everything about how the galaxy viewed humanity. Claire arrived at the council chambers on Varathus, and she walked through doors that had been closed to humans for 3 weeks, and every ambassador and representative from every species turned to stare at her as she made her way to the human delegation platform. Chairman Vexlar spoke first, and his voice carried a mixture of relief and confusion, and he said, "Ambassador Foster, we are pleased to see that humanity still exists, but we must demand an explanation for your silence, and for the reports we are receiving about conflict with the Krell Empire." Claire smiled, and it was not a warm smile, but rather the kind of smile that predators show before they strike, and she activated the holographic display system in the center of the council chamber and said, "I am happy to provide that explanation." The display showed a map of Krell space and human space, and the invasion routes that the Krell fleet had taken, and then it showed what was left of that fleet, which was less than 40% of its original strength, limping back to Krell territory in disorder and defeat. Claire began speaking, and her voice was calm and clear, and she said, "For 200 years, humanity has participated in galactic society, and we have broadcast our culture and our entertainment and our daily lives across every communication channel, and you have all listened and formed your opinions about who we are and what we are capable of." She paused and let that sink in, and then she continued and said, "You concluded that we were loud and chaotic and emotional, and you found us amusing but primitive, and you assumed that our constant noise meant we were disorganized and unprepared for serious matters like warfare, and the Krell Empire made that same assumption when they decided to invade our territory." The display changed to show footage from the battle at New Portland, and the council members watched in stunned silence as human defense platforms emerged from stealth and destroyed Krell warships with devastating efficiency and precision. Claire said the Krell expected to find frightened civilians and weak defenses, and instead they found a coordinated military response that had been planned and prepared for months, and they lost over 1,800 ships in the first day of combat, and the survivors are still trying to understand what happened. Vexlar leaned forward in his seat and said, "But how is this possible? And the Krell are a Tier 2 military power, and they have conquered 17 species, and your military was assessed as adequate for self-defense, but not capable of offensive operations." Claire's smile widened, and she said that assessment was based on what we allowed you to see. And while we were broadcasting entertainment and sports, we were also studying warfare and building weapons and developing tactics, and you never noticed because you were too busy being amused by our noise. She changed the display again, and now it showed detailed intelligence reports on every major military power in the galaxy, and their weapon systems, and their tactical doctrines, and their strategic weaknesses, and the council members shifted uncomfortably as they realized how much information humanity had gathered. Claire continued and said, "Every species in this chamber has fought wars and developed strategies and created military technologies, and you have all shared this information freely through historical records and tactical databases and cultural exchanges, and we studied all of it and learned from all of it and prepared countermeasures for all of it." A delegate from the Thorin Collective stood up and said, "This is deception, and you have been lying to us for 2 centuries about your true capabilities." And Claire turned to face him and said, "No, we simply allowed you to make assumptions based on incomplete information, and that is not the same as lying." She brought up new data and said, "While you were listening to our music, we were mapping your star systems, and while you were watching our sports games, we were analyzing your ship designs, and while you were consuming our entertainment, we were learning everything we could about potential threats." The council chamber erupted in angry voices and accusations of betrayal and demands for explanations, and Claire waited patiently for the noise to die down before she spoke again. She said, "Humanity came to the stars hoping for peace, and we have been peaceful, and we have traded fairly, and we have contributed to galactic culture, and we have followed council laws. But we also remembered our own history, and our history taught us that peace is temporary, and those who are unprepared become victims." Claire displayed images of Earth's history and showed wars and conflicts and empires rising and falling, and she said humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years, and we developed strategy and tactics across hundreds of different cultures and millions of battles, and when we reached the stars we did not forget any of that knowledge. Vexlar raised his hand for silence, and the chamber grew quiet, and he said, "What you are describing is a level of military preparation that suggests you expected conflict, And Claire nodded and said, "We hoped for peace, but prepared for war, and the Krell invasion proved that our preparation was necessary." Another delegate asked how many other species humanity had prepared contingency plans against. And Claire paused before answering and said, "We have analyzed potential conflict scenarios with every major power in the galaxy, and we have theoretical countermeasures for every known weapons system and tactical doctrine." The chamber fell silent again, and this time the silence was heavy with fear and suspicion. And Claire understood that she had just fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with every species in the galaxy. She said softly, "We did not do this because we are aggressive or because we want conflict, and we did it because we are survivors and we understand that the universe is dangerous, and those who are not prepared to defend themselves will eventually lose everything they have built." A military advisor to the council named General Court stood and said, "You have essentially admitted to planning wars against allied species, and that violates the spirit, if not the letter of council law." And Claire shook her head and said, "Planning for possibilities is not the same as planning aggression, and every species in this chamber has military contingency plans, and we simply made ours more comprehensive." Vexler asked the question that everyone was thinking, which was, what else has humanity been hiding? And Claire smiled again and said, "That is not a question I am prepared to answer fully, but I will say that everything you have seen so far represents our defensive capabilities, and you have not yet seen what we are capable of when we go on the offensive." The implications of that statement rippled through the chamber, and Claire could see the calculations happening in every delegate's mind as they reassessed everything they thought they knew about humanity. She brought up one final display and said, "The Krell invasion has been decisively defeated, and their remaining forces are retreating to their own territory, and humanity is currently discussing terms for their surrender, and we expect the Krell High Command to agree to those terms within the week." Court said, "You are dictating terms to a Tier 2 military power." And Claire said, "Yes, we are. And those terms will include significant restrictions on their military capabilities, and reparations for the damage they attempted to cause, and occupation of certain strategic territories to ensure compliance." Vexlar looked old suddenly and tired, and he said the council will need time to process this information, and to reassess our understanding of humanity's role in galactic affairs. And Claire nodded and said, "Of course, and humanity will continue to participate in council activities in trade and cultural exchange, but we will do so as equals who demand respect, rather than as newcomers who can be patronized." She gathered her materials and prepared to leave, and before she did, she said one more thing, and the entire chamber turned to listen, and she said, "Humanity went silent because we needed to fight without being observed, and now that the fight is over, we will resume our broadcasts and our noise and our participation in galactic society. But you should all understand that the silence is always available to us, and if we go silent again, it means we have identified another threat, and we are preparing to eliminate it." Claire walked out of the council chamber and left behind a galaxy that would never look at humanity the same way again, and she felt satisfied because the mission had been accomplished, and humanity had announced to the entire GA that they were not prey, but predators who had chosen to be civilized. The war lasted 6 months, and by the end of it, the Krell Empire had been completely dismantled as a military power, and the galaxy watched in amazement as humanity demonstrated capabilities that no one had suspected they possessed. Admiral Jake Morrison now held the rank that matched his position, and he coordinated the human military from a command center on Earth, and he spent most of his time explaining to politicians and reporters how humanity had achieved such a decisive victory. Jake stood in front of cameras broadcasting across the galaxy, and he spoke with the same calm voice he had used when ordering protocol silence. And he said, "People want to know how we won, and the answer is not complicated, and we won because we understood that information is the most valuable weapon in any conflict." He gestured to displays showing human military history from ancient Earth battles to modern space warfare. And he said, "Humans have been fighting wars for our entire existence, and we have learned from every victory and every defeat, and we carried all of that knowledge with us when we came to the stars." Jake explained that when humanity joined the galactic community, they made a deliberate choice to appear less dangerous than they actually were. And he said, "We wanted to be welcomed and accepted, so we emphasized our culture and our entertainment." and our desire for trade while quietly building defenses that could protect us if welcome turned to hostility. A reporter from the Thorin News Network asked if humanity had been planning for war since they first made contact with alien species, and Jake shook his head and said, "We were not planning for war, and we were planning to survive. And there is a difference between wanting conflict and being ready for it." He continued and said every human child learns about the wars of Earth, and the empires that fell because they were unprepared, and the civilizations that survived because they stayed vigilant. And when we reached the stars, we applied those lessons, because the universe does not care about good intentions. Lieutenant Amy Parker, who had been promoted to commander, gave interviews to military journals across the galaxy, and she explained the technical details of how humanity had hidden their true capabilities. Amy sat across from a Varathi military analyst and said the key was understanding what people were looking for, and then showing them exactly that while hiding everything else, and the galaxy wanted to see humans as merchants and entertainers, so we gave them that image while building weapons in classified facilities. She brought up schematics of human stealth technology and said this was developed over 50 years using principles we learned from studying natural phenomena and alien sensor technology, and we tested it extensively, but always in deep space where no one was watching. The analyst asked how humans had coordinated such a massive deception across hundreds of worlds and billions of people, and Amy smiled and said it was not deception, and it was compartmentalization, and most humans did not know about the military preparations, and they genuinely were merchants and entertainers, and only a small percentage of our population was involved in defense planning. Colonel Greg Hayes became famous across human space for his defense of New Portland, and he gave speeches at military academies about the importance of preparation and patience. Greg told a room full of young officers that the hardest part of the battle was waiting in silence while the enemy landed and explored and thought they had won. And he said every instinct told us to open fire immediately. But we waited because we knew that patience would multiply our advantage. He explained that the Krell had expected humans to fight emotionally and react impulsively, and by doing the opposite, humanity had created confusion and doubt in the enemy's decision-making process. And he said, "War is not just about weapons and ships, and it is about psychology and making your enemy question everything they think they know." Captain Ryan Walsh led the counteroffensive that pushed deep into Krell territory and dismantled their military infrastructure piece by piece, and he became known for tactics that other species found confusing and dishonorable. Ryan commanded a fleet of fast attack ships that struck supply lines and communication hubs and manufacturing centers, while avoiding direct confrontation with large Krell battle groups, and when asked why he did not fight honorably, he laughed and said, "Honor is what you can afford after you have survived." He told his officers that the Krell expected enemies to meet them in open battle, because that was how honorable species fought. But humans had learned thousands of years ago that the winner of a war is the side that is still standing when the fighting ends, and how you get there matters less than the fact that you do. The Krell High Command surrendered after their homeworld's orbital defenses were disabled by a human special operations team that infiltrated the planet using methods that the Krell military could not detect or counter. The terms of surrender were harsh, and they included complete disarmament of offensive military forces and occupation of key territories by human peacekeeping units, and reparations that would take decades to pay, and restrictions on shipbuilding and weapons research that would prevent the Krell from ever threatening anyone again. Fleet Commander Drask, who had led the initial invasion, was brought to Earth to sign the surrender documents, and he stood in a room with human military leaders and looked at the people who had destroyed his empire's ambitions. Drask said to Jake, "Morrison, you tricked us and you pretended to be weak, and then you struck when we were unprepared, and that is not honorable warfare." And Jake looked at him without sympathy and said, "We did not pretend to be weak, and we simply did not advertise our strength, and you assumed weakness because you wanted us to be weak, and that assumption cost you everything." The galaxy struggled to adapt to the new reality, and private military channels across every species buzzed with discussions about human capabilities and how to counter them if conflict ever arose. Admiral Susan Blake took command of Earth's new Strategic Defense Initiative, and she oversaw the construction of a military structure that would operate in permanent silence except when absolutely necessary. Susan gave a classified briefing to human political leaders and said, The galaxy now knows we are dangerous, but they do not know the full extent of our capabilities, and we need to keep it that way. And she explained that humanity's greatest weapon was not any particular technology, but rather the uncertainty they had created in potential enemies. She said every species is now trying to figure out what else we are hiding, and they are developing countermeasures to the tactics we used against the Krell, and that is exactly what we want, because while they are preparing for the last war, we are developing strategies for the next one. President Nathan Cross addressed humanity from the Capitol and said the war has taught the galaxy to respect us, but respect based on fear is unstable, and we must now demonstrate that we can be both strong and fair. Nathan explained that human forces would occupy Krell territory not as conquerors but as peacekeepers, helping to rebuild a society that could coexist with its neighbors. And he said we will show the galaxy that humans can win wars without becoming the monsters that started them. The speech was broadcast across human space, and carefully edited versions were sent to alien worlds, and the message was clear, which was that humanity could be a powerful friend or a devastating enemy, and the choice of which they would be was up to everyone else. Commander Kate Brooks, whose brother Danny had died defending a monitoring station during the early stages of the war, accepted his posthumous medal in a ceremony that was attended by thousands. Kate stood at the podium with her brother's medal in her hands, and she said Danny and thousands of others died in silence so that humanity could speak freely again, and they gave their lives so that we could choose our own path among the stars, and we honor them by living in a way that makes their sacrifice meaningful. She looked out at the crowd and said my brother believed that peace was worth fighting for, and that strength was the foundation of security. And he understood that sometimes the greatest act of courage is preparing for a war you hope will never come. The ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy, and many alien species watched and began to understand that humanity's military capability was not just about technology or tactics, but about a culture that valued both peace and the willingness to fight for it. Jake Morrison retired from active military service and took a position advising the government on strategic defense, and in his final public address as a serving officer, he said when humanity went silent, we made a statement about who we are, and we are not just entertainers and merchants, and we are survivors who chose civilization, but never forgot how to fight. And the galaxy needs to understand that the silence is always an option, and if we use it again, it means we have identified a threat and we are preparing to eliminate it completely. A year after the war ended, humanity resumed its broadcasts and the music returned, and the entertainment programs came back and the cultural exchanges started again. But everyone in the galaxy listened with different ears now, because they understood that the noise was only part of the story. Ambassador Claire Foster reopened Earth's embassy on Varathis, and she walked through the diplomatic quarter that had once dismissed humans as amusing but harmless, and now those same diplomats watched her with respect mixed with caution and some fear. Claire met with Chairman Vexlar in his private office, and they shared a meal that was carefully prepared to accommodate both human and Vorathi dietary needs. And Vexlar said the Council has adjusted its classification of humanity from a developing spacefaring species to a major galactic power. Claire smiled and said we appreciate the recognition, but we want to be clear that we are still the same species we always were, and we still value trade and cooperation and cultural exchange, and we still believe in working together rather than against each other. Vexlar set down his eating utensil and said, but you are also a species that can destroy a Tier 2 military power in 6 months, and that capability changes everything about how we must interact with you. Claire nodded and said yes it does, and we understand that. And we want the galaxy to know that our strength exists to protect our interests and our allies and not to threaten peaceful species, and we hope that knowledge brings stability rather than fear. The Krell territory was placed under human administration as part of the peace settlement, and Commodore Lisa Monroe oversaw the reconstruction efforts with a team of human peacekeepers and civilian advisors. Lisa walked through the ruins of a Krell military base that had been destroyed during the war, and she met with local Krell leaders who were struggling to rebuild their society without the military structure that had defined them for centuries. A Krell elder named Thorvik asked Lisa why humans were helping to rebuild when they could have simply left the Krell to suffer. And Lisa said because we understand that winning a war is not the same as winning a peace, and we want neighbors who can prosper, not enemies who plot revenge. She explained that humans had fought enough wars in their own history to know that crushing a defeated enemy completely only creates more conflict in the future. And she said, "We want the Krell people to build a society that does not need conquest to feel powerful." Thorvik looked at her with confusion and said, "Your species is strange and you fight without honor. And then you help those you defeated, and I do not understand why." Lisa smiled and said, "Honor is defined differently by different species and humans. Believe that true strength includes mercy, and that victory means nothing if it requires us to become the same as those who started the conflict." The galaxy adapted to the new reality and trade continued and diplomacy flourished, but military planners across every species began studying human tactics and developing countermeasures and preparing for the possibility that humanity might one day turn its attention toward them. Captain Ryan Walsh returned to Earth as a celebrated war hero, but he chose to teach at the Strategic Academy rather than accept promotions or political positions, and he spent his days training the next generation of human officers. Ryan stood in front of a classroom filled with students both human and alien, because the Academy had started accepting foreign military officers who wanted to learn human tactics, and he said the most important lesson from the war is that we won, because we surprised them and next time we will not have surprise on our side. He explained that every species in the galaxy was now studying how humans fought and developing strategies to counter those tactics, and he said this means we must continue to evolve and innovate, because the moment we become predictable is the moment we become vulnerable. An alien student from the Thorin Collective asked if humans would share their military knowledge with allies, and Ryan paused before answering and said, "We will share some things with trusted partners, but we will never share everything, because even allies can become enemies if circumstances change." Admiral Jake Morrison spent his retirement writing a comprehensive analysis of Protocol Silence and the war that followed, and his work became required reading at military academies across the galaxy. Jake wrote that humanity's greatest advantage was not technology or numbers, but rather cultural memory, and he explained that humans carried the lessons of thousands of years of warfare, and those lessons had been passed down through generations in stories and histories and traditions. He wrote that other species had longer histories and more advanced technology, but many of them had forgotten how to fight because they had not needed to for centuries, and he said humans never forgot because warfare was woven into every culture and every society on Earth. The book concluded with a warning, and Jake wrote that humanity had demonstrated it could win wars, but the real test would be whether humans could maintain peace while remaining strong enough to deter aggression. And he said this balance between strength and restraint would define humanity's future among the stars. On colonies across human space, memorials were erected to honor those who died during the war, and the names were read aloud in ceremonies that broadcast across the galaxy as a reminder that humanity's silence had come at a cost. Kate Brooks attended every memorial ceremony she could reach, and she spoke about her brother Danny and the thousands of others who had died defending humanity's right to choose its own path. And she said they died in silence so that we could speak freely, and they gave everything so that we could build something worth protecting. The ceremonies were watched by millions of aliens, and many began to understand that humanity's military strength was built on sacrifice and shared purpose, rather than just technology and tactics. The Galactic Council established new protocols for military transparency, and every species submitted detailed assessments of their forces to prevent another surprise, like the one humanity had engineered. Claire reviewed the protocols, and she ensured that humanity complied fully by sharing information about ship numbers and weapon types and defensive capabilities, but she carefully avoided sharing anything about tactics or strategies or the innovative approaches that had won the war. She met with Council security officials and said, "Humanity believes in transparency within reasonable limits, but we also believe that some information is properly kept confidential for security reasons, and the line between appropriate sharing and dangerous exposure must be carefully maintained." A council investigator asked if humanity was planning to keep secrets that could threaten galactic security, and Claire replied that humanity was keeping secrets that protected human security, and there was an important difference. As the galaxy settled into its new equilibrium, humanity's broadcasts continued, and perhaps they were even louder than before because humans felt they had earned the right to be heard without being dismissed or patronized. The music and art and culture flowed from Earth and its colonies across the stars, and alien species consumed human entertainment and bought human products and participated in human cultural festivals, but now they did so with an awareness that had not existed before. Admiral Susan Blake expanded the Strategic Defense Initiative into a comprehensive program that monitored potential threats and developed contingency plans and maintained humanity's readiness to respond to any crisis. Susan told her staff in private meetings that the galaxy now knew humans were dangerous, but they did not know the full extent of human capabilities. And she said, "This uncertainty is our shield, and we must maintain it by continuing to innovate in secret while sharing enough information to appear transparent." She created programs that trained human forces in new tactics and developed new technologies and explored new strategies that built on the lessons of the Krell War, and she ensured that everything was done in facilities that were shielded from observation and protected by security measures that other species could not penetrate. President Nathan Cross gave an address on the anniversary of Protocol Silence, and he stood in front of the War Memorial on Earth and said 1 year ago, humanity went silent, and that silence changed our relationship with the galaxy forever. He continued and said, "We learned that strength must be demonstrated occasionally to be believed. And we learned that peace requires the capability to wage war. And we learned that the galaxy respects those who can defend themselves and dismisses those who cannot." Nathan looked directly into the cameras and said, "Humanity will continue to broadcast our culture and share our innovations and participate in galactic society, but we will also continue to prepare for threats and maintain forces capable of defending our interests, and the silence remains available to us if we ever need it again." The message was clear to everyone watching, and humanity had announced that they would be peaceful but never weak, and friendly but never naive, and they would engage with the galaxy on terms of mutual respect or not at all. Jake Morrison, in his private journals, wrote words that would eventually become humanity's unofficial motto, and he wrote that humans are loud, so others will listen, and silent, so others will fear, and always watching for the next threat because survival demands constant vigilance. The war had ended, but the preparation never would, and humanity had changed from a species that hoped for peace into a species that created peace through strength. The galaxy had wanted humanity to be entertaining neighbors who could be safely ignored when convenient, and they got their wish in some ways because humans were still entertaining and still friendly. But they also got something they had not expected, which was a species that refused to be victims or pawns in anyone else's plans. When humanity went silent, the war began, and when humanity started speaking again, the galaxy